cold air hung over northern Indiana on the morning of January 14th, 1999, when deputies found the bodies, 12 farmhands buried beneath wind-cut rows of frozen corn. Hours earlier, 3 armed men left their homes, each carrying a rifle older than they were. By sunrise, 12 people lay dead, scattered between machinery sheds, trailers, and a gravel access road no one had driven in weeks. The paradox, investigators later said, was almost unbearable. It wasn't drugs, it wasn't cartel. It started over a witnessed murder, one no one was supposed to talk about. A single truth overheard in the wrong barn, on the wrong night, and 3 men convinced themselves silence had to be bought in blood. The fog that morning muffled everything: boots, breath, prayers. If you have the courage to hear this story, stay with us. Like and subscribe for more investigative reconstructions. Content warning: graphic violence based on real events. By late autumn of 1998, Benton County, Indiana, had become a study in slow collapse. The land stretched flat under gray November skies, cornfields stripped to stubble, irrigation ditches choked with frost, barns leaning at angles that suggested surrender rather than age. This was territory once sustained by corn and hog operations, but the fertilizer plant outside Boswell had closed in 1996, taking 340 jobs with it. What remained was a patchwork economy built on disability checks, seasonal work, and the kind of pride that outlasts prosperity. Sheriff Harold McCreary ran the county with 3 rotating deputies covering 406 square miles. He was 52 that year, a Vietnam veteran with worn-out boots and an honest face that had seen too much. His office sat in a brick building in Fowler, the county seat, where he kept case files in metal cabinets and brewed coffee in a pot older than most of his staff. The phone rarely rang with urgent matters: domestic disputes, stolen equipment, occasional drunk driving on Route 41. The Lafferty brothers, Dale, Mitch, and Joel, lived on the remnants of their father's failed hog farm 3 miles south of Earl Park. Their father had lost the operation in 1995 to debt and mismanagement, and the auction had stripped the place down to skeletal infrastructure: a machine shed with a cracked foundation, a trailer home with peeling siding, and 40 acres of rented corn they couldn't afford to plant themselves. The brothers stayed because leaving felt like admitting defeat. Dale, the eldest at 39, worked intermittent shifts at a grain co-op. Mitch, 36, repaired small engines in the shed behind the trailer. Joel, the youngest at 31, had been laid off from a seed processing plant in Lafayette the previous spring and hadn't found steady work since. They drank coffee from a dented metal thermos every morning, passing it between them while the propane heater struggled against the cold. Across the county, in places forgotten by prosperity, silence becomes a currency. People learned not to ask questions, not to repeat what they heard, not to involve law enforcement unless absolutely necessary. Mountain justice, some called it. Though these weren't mountains, just flat land and flat prospects, and the understanding that some things were handled privately. By December, unemployment in Benton County had climbed to 19%. Sheriff McCreary noted in his year-end report that economic conditions were catastrophically unsustainable. The Escobedo family had arrived in Benton County 6 years earlier, following harvest work north from Texas. They never left. Marcos Escobedo, 34, worked 2 farm jobs, one planting and dissing for a corporate operation near Boswell, another doing equipment maintenance for smaller landowners who couldn't afford full-time help. His wife, Anna, 32, cared for their 3 children and served as informal translator for the dozen migrant families clustered in trailers behind the old Quonset hut on County Road 600 West. Their home was a single-wide trailer with faded blue siding, warmed by a propane heater that ticked and hissed through winter nights. The children, ages 12, 9, and 6, attended Earl Park Elementary, where they were quiet, polite, and fluent in both English and Spanish. Anna kept a small garden plot in summer and attended Mass at St. Mary's in Fowler every Sunday. Luis Peña, 17, lived 2 trailers down with his uncle's family. He'd dropped out of high school the previous year to work full-time, sending money back to relatives in Jalisco. He was thin, serious, good with machinery. Farmers liked him because he showed up on time and didn't complain. He saved his wages in a coffee can under his bed, dreaming of mechanic school in Indianapolis. The trailers sat in a loose cluster at the edge of a soybean field, connected by gravel paths and a shared understanding that they were temporary even when permanence set in. Wood smoke rose from stovepipes on cold mornings. Children played between rusted equipment. The air smelled of diesel, damp earth, and the inevitability of another hard season. Life in rural Indiana unfolded in cycles: planting, harvest, winter silence. Normalcy was built day by day. School buses on gravel roads, grocery runs to the IGA in Earl Park, occasional birthday parties where someone brought a cake from the bakery in Fowler. Ana Escobedo kept a photograph of her children taped to the refrigerator door. Marcos listened to the Pacers on a transistor radio while he cleaned spark plugs at the kitchen table. These were ordinary people doing ordinary work in a place where poverty didn't announce itself. It simply was. They weren't invisible, but they also weren't seen, not really. They existed in the margins of the county's economy, essential but unacknowledged, their labor quietly sustaining operations that could barely sustain themselves. Luis Peña's sealed affidavit, written weeks later, would anchor the entire investigation. But in November 1998, he was just a teenager, hauling feed bags and hoping for something better than cold mornings and borrowed tools. The first death happened on December 18, 1998, at a private livestock sale 4 miles west of Earl Park. It wasn't a formal auction, just a dozen men gathered in a barn to sell off breeding stock before winter feed costs became unmanageable. Cash transactions, no paperwork, the kind of commerce that existed outside official records. Calvin Ritchie, 42, arrived late and drunk. He was a hog farmer from the next county over, known for buying cheap and haggling hard. He'd insulted Mitch Lafferty during a previous sale, something about inferior stock and wasted money, and Mitch hadn't forgotten. When Calvin started drinking from a pint bottle and loudly questioning the quality of a gilt Mitch was selling, the tension escalated quickly. Witnesses later provided conflicting accounts. Some said Calvin shoved Mitch first. Others claimed Mitch started it with a string of profanity that questioned Calvin's competence, his sobriety, his manhood. What's certain is that the argument moved outside, into the gravel lot behind the barn, where Mitch grabbed a tire iron from the bed of his truck. The blow came fast, a single swing that connected with the side of Calvin's head. He dropped immediately, his body making a sound against the packed dirt that one witness described as heavy, like a feed sack. Blood pooled dark beneath his skull. He stopped breathing within 3 minutes. 3 men saw it clearly. 2 were cousins of the Laffertys, and they stepped back into the shadows without a word. The third was Luis Peña, who'd been hired to load feed bags into trucks and happened to be stacking burlap sacks near the barn door when the argument erupted. He looked right at me, Luis later told investigators. Then he wiped the iron clean on his jeans. The men dragged Calvin's body into the barn and covered it with a tarp. They agreed to call it an accident. Calvin had slipped, hit his head. Maybe he'd been too drunk to stand. They'd report it in the morning after they'd all had time to think. But morning came and no one called the sheriff. Calvin Ritchie's truck stayed parked behind the barn for 2 days before someone drove it to a rest stop near Lafayette and left it with the keys in the ignition. A missing person report was filed on December 22nd, 4 days too late to matter. His wife told deputies he'd gone to a livestock sale and never came home. The investigation stalled within a week. No body, no witnesses willing to talk, no evidence of foul play. In rural communities, codes often protect families more than the law ever could. But codes depend on silence, and silence depends on trust. And Luis Peña had been raised to believe the truth mattered more than convenience. He told his uncle what he'd seen. His uncle told Ana Escobedo. By the first week of January, the whisper had circulated through the migrant community like smoke through a closed room. The confrontation happened on January 3rd, 1999, outside the grain co-op where Dale Lafferty worked part-time. A cousin of Calvin Ritchie, a man named Ray Pritchard, who ran a small engine repair shop in Oxford, pulled into the lot just as Dale was locking up for the evening. Ray stepped out of his truck and walked directly toward Dale with the kind of deliberate purpose that announces trouble before words do. "You think this dies with you?" Ray said. Dale stopped, keys still in his hand. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Calvin, the sale. I hear there's a kid who saw what happened." Dale's face didn't change, but his shoulders tightened. "Kids see all kinds of things. Doesn't make it real." Ray took another step forward. "You tell Mitch that people are asking questions, and you tell him running out the clock doesn't work when witnesses start talking." Dale waited until Ray drove away before he got in his own truck. He sat there for 5 minutes, engine idling, breath fogging the windshield. Then he drove home and called Mitch. Phone records later showed 6 calls between Dale and Mitch within an hour. Another 3 calls to Joel. By 9 that evening, all 3 brothers were sitting in Mitch's machine shed, the space heater glowing orange against the cold. Secrets, investigators would later note, don't stay buried in soil this flat. The land offers no natural concealment, no hollows or ridges or dense forests where things can disappear. Everything is visible from a distance: farmhouses, trailers, trucks moving along gravel roads. Silence is the only cover available, and silence requires cooperation. Luis Peña had broken that cooperation without realizing the stakes. He'd told the truth because he believed truth was neutral, a fact that existed independent of consequence. But in a place where families protected their own and law enforcement was a distant abstraction, truth became a threat. Mitch understood this instinctively. His father had taught him that reputation was all a poor man had left, and a reputation destroyed by criminal charges, manslaughter, maybe murder, would finish what the bank had started. The farm was already gone. If Mitch went to prison, the family name would be gone too. "We handle it," Mitch said that night in the shed. "Mountain handles mountain." Dale and Joel didn't respond immediately. They knew what "handle it" meant. They'd grown up with stories about feuds settled privately, about men who disappeared after crossing the wrong family, about justice that happened in barns and back roads where no one asked questions. The wind outside rattled the shed's metal siding. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked twice and went silent. Economic desperation has a weight that accumulates slowly, like snow on a sagging roof. By January 1999, the Lafferty brothers carried that weight in every unpaid bill, every empty diesel tank, every call from creditors who'd stopped accepting promises. Joel had been unemployed for 8 months. Dale's co-op shifts had been cut to 2 days a week. Mitch's small engine work barely covered propane for the heater. Their father's farm auction in 1995 had been public humiliation. Neighbors watching as equipment they'd maintained for decades sold for pennies on the dollar, watching as the bank claimed land their grandfather had cleared by hand. The brothers had stood in the back of the crowd, silent, while the auctioneer's voice echoed across ground that no longer belonged to them. Pride in such circumstances becomes pathological. It's the last possession that can't be auctioned. the final boundary between dignity and dissolution. For men raised to believe self-sufficiency was synonymous with worth, the prospect of criminal prosecution represented total erasure. Joel had tried to leave once, had gotten as far as Fort Wayne, before running out of money and returning with nothing but a deeper sense of failure. Mitch had a GED, but no prospects beyond the shed, where he rebuilt carburetors and pretended tomorrow might be different. Dale kept showing up to the co-op because the alternative, sitting in the trailer waiting for nothing, felt like dying slowly. Statistics from that period paint the broader picture. Indiana's rural counties saw a 19% unemployment increase between 1996 and 1999. Farm subsidy delays hit families with maxed-out credit lines. Bankruptcy filings in Benton County doubled. The local food bank ran out of supplies twice in December. But statistics don't capture what it feels like to watch your father's legacy dissolve, to be treated as surplus labor in a county that once knew your family name, to understand that no amount of work will restore what's been lost. The brothers weren't unique. There were dozens of families in similar positions, maybe hundreds across the rural Midwest. What made them different was the choice they were about to make. On January 5th, a foreclosure notice appeared on the barn door. Final warning for unpaid property taxes on the 40 acres they rented but couldn't afford. The county would auction the lease rights in March. Mitch tore the notice down and crumpled it without reading past the header. He already knew what it said. He'd known since the phone call in November, since the certified letter in December, since the morning he'd watched his father cry quietly at the kitchen table years earlier. Pride is a poor man's last possession. Losing it, for some, feels indistinguishable from dying. And if dying is inevitable, then defending what remains, even through violence, becomes its own terrible logic. "They're taking everything," Joel said that evening, staring at the crumpled notice on the shed floor. "Not everything," Mitch replied. "Not yet." The plan formed over 3 days, spoken in fragments and half-sentences, never fully articulated but understood through shared silence. They met in Mitch's machine shed after dark, the space heater casting shadows across tools hung on pegboard walls. The coffee thermos passed between them, lukewarm and bitter, while they worked through the operational details of what they couldn't quite name out loud. Weapons first. Mitch owned a Remington 870 shotgun, 12-gauge, purchased used from a pawnshop in Lafayette in 1992. Dale had a Winchester Model 70 rifle chambered in .30-06, inherited from their father, good for deer hunting and accurate to 300 yards. Joel contributed a Ruger 1022, a .22 caliber semi-automatic he'd bought for small game. They cleaned the guns methodically, running patches through barrels, checking firing pins, loading shells into magazines with the practiced efficiency of men who'd hunted since childhood. They discussed the trailers, how many, who lived where, the layout of the gravel paths between structures. Dale had driven past the Escobedo cluster twice that week, noting the Quonset hut, the propane tanks, the single security light mounted on a pole that illuminated maybe 30 feet of gravel. He sketched a rough map on the back of a feed receipt. 5 trailers arranged in a loose semicircle, the nearest one set back maybe 200 feet from the county road. "Who needs to be there?" Joel asked. Mitch didn't answer immediately. He was sharpening a hunting knife on a whetstone, the blade scraping rhythmically against stone. Anyone who heard, anyone who could talk. They listed names, Luis Peña first, then his uncle, then Marcos Escobedo, who'd been seen talking with Luis near the co-op a week earlier. The list grew as paranoia filled the spaces where certainty should have been. Maybe Ana Escobedo knew. Maybe the children had overheard. Maybe everyone in those trailers had been told, had whispered it to each other in Spanish while the brothers remained ignorant. "We go at night," Dale said. Fog's supposed to roll in tomorrow. Joel's hands shook slightly as he loaded .22 rounds into the Ruger's rotary magazine. What if? No, Mitch interrupted. No, what if? This is already decided. Later, during his confession, Joel would tell investigators, I didn't think we'd go through with it until we started cleaning the guns. Then I knew we'd already crossed something we couldn't cross back. The weather forecast called for dense fog. Wednesday night into Thursday morning. Visibility near zero. Temperature dropping to 18 degrees. Violence, investigators often note, begins quietly, in sheds and basements, with tools meant for work turned toward other purposes. The decision is made long before the trigger is pulled. In the moment, weapons are cleaned and plans are sketched, and men convince themselves that eliminating witnesses is somehow different from murder. The coffee thermos sat empty on the workbench, metal dented from years of use, as ordinary as anything else in that shed. By dusk on January 13, 1999, fog had settled across Benton County like a gray wool blanket pressed down from above. Visibility dropped to less than 30 feet. Headlights became diffuse yellow orbs that warned of vehicles but revealed nothing about them. The temperature had fallen to 20 degrees by 6:15, cold enough that breath condensed immediately, that metal surfaces stung bare skin, that sound traveled strangely, muffled in some directions, sharp in others. The Lafferty brothers loaded the rifles into Dale's 1985 Chevy K10 pickup, a faded blue truck with rust bubbling through the wheel wells and a cracked windshield held together by duct tape. They placed the weapons on the bench seat between them, shotgun, rifle, .22, along with 2 boxes of shells and the hunting knife Mitch had sharpened the night before. Joel brought a flashlight with dying batteries. Dale brought a county road map marked with distances and turnoff points. 3.1 miles separated their trailer from the Escobedo cluster. The route followed County Road 600 west, through empty cornfields, past an abandoned hog barn with a collapsed roof, across a rusted bridge spanning a drainage ditch, too shallow to freeze completely. At the Escobedo trailers, ordinary evening routines unfolded with the predictable rhythm of winter domesticity. Marcos Escobedo sat in the trailer's small living room watching the Indiana Pacers play the Chicago Bulls on a 13-inch television with rabbit ear antennas. The reception flickered and ghosted, but the game was clear enough. His youngest daughter did homework at the kitchen table, while Anna stirred a pot of beans on the propane stove. The heater ticked steadily, fighting the cold that seeped through thin walls and single-pane windows. Luis Peña was 2 trailers down, eating leftover tamales his aunt had made the previous day. He planned to watch the game later if his uncle's television picked up the signal. Tomorrow he'd work a half-day repairing fence posts. For a farmer near Boswell, cash under the table, $40 he'd add to the coffee can under his bed. 3 trailers over, a mother sang softly to her infant, while her husband smoked a cigarette outside, watching fog obscure the security light's glow. 2 children played cards in another trailer, arguing cheerfully about the rules of Go Fish. Someone had baked cornbread. The smell drifted through the cold air, mixing with wood smoke and propane. Most massacres, investigators later observe, begin while someone finishes an ordinary evening. While a father watches basketball, while a mother stirs dinner, while children complete homework under fluorescent light. The contrast is almost unbearable, the mundane routines of survival occurring simultaneously with preparations for their elimination. At 7:04 p.m., a grain hauler traveling north on County Road 600 noted a pickup truck with one headlight moving slowly through fog. He didn't recognize the vehicle but thought nothing of it. Rural roads at night were populated by farmers checking equipment, teenagers looking for empty places to drink beer, men driving home after late shifts. The truck turned west onto an unmarked gravel access road and disappeared into fog thick enough to erase everything more than 20 feet distant. Luis Peña stepped outside to smoke at 7:18 p.m. He didn't smoke regularly, just occasionally, when restlessness or worry made sitting inside feel impossible. He stood on the wooden steps outside his uncle's trailer, collar turned up against the cold, striking a match that flared orange in the fog. The shot came from elevated angle. Later, forensic analysis would indicate the shooter fired from the bed of a truck positioned approximately 40 feet away. The .30-06 round entered Luis's upper chest, angled downward, passed through his right lung and aorta, and exited below his left shoulder blade. He collapsed backward, his body striking the trailer's aluminum siding before sliding down to rest on the gravel, with his legs bent beneath him. Marcos Escobedo heard the sound, not immediately recognizable as gunfire, more like something heavy dropped from height, or lumber falling, and stepped to the window. Through fog, he saw a shape on the ground near Luis's trailer. Something wrong about its stillness. He opened his door and took 3 steps outside before calling Luis's name. 2 shotgun blasts answered. The first hit Marcos in the abdomen, lifting him slightly and spinning him sideways. The second caught him as he fell, destroying his upper chest and right shoulder. He landed face down on the gravel path, blood spreading dark and immediate, steam rising where warmth met frozen ground. Ana Escobedo screamed, a sound that carried despite fog, high and sharp, and abruptly cut off when Dale Lafferty kicked the trailer door open and fired the Winchester through the doorway without aiming. The round passed through the thin wall near the kitchen, missing Ana but striking the propane heater and sending shrapnel into the ceiling. The children started screaming. "Out!" Dale shouted. "Everyone out!" Ana emerged with her hands raised, her 3 children behind her. Joel Lafferty stood near the truck, the Ruger 22 held at chest height, but not aimed at anything specific. His face was pale, eyes wide, breath coming in short gasps that fogged the air. "Please," Ana said in English, "please, my children." Mitch fired the shotgun again, the blast catching Ana in the side and dropping her instantly. The children scattered, 2 running toward the darkness beyond the trailers, 1 freezing in place, 2 terrified to move. Dale shot the frozen child, a boy, 9 years old, with the Winchester. The other 2 disappeared into cornrows, stumbling through fog and stalks, their screams muffled by distance and fear. A neighbor 3 trailers away, a man named Garcia, opened his door and immediately slammed it shut when he saw shapes moving through fog, heard the unmistakable rhythm of gunfire. He gathered his family into the bathroom and told them to lie in the tub, away from windows. The farmhands who'd been playing cards heard the shots and ran, 2 toward the irrigation ditch, 1 toward the Quonset hut, another flattening himself beneath a rusted trailer without wheels. The fog that obscured the shooters also obscured escape routes. Men ran toward sounds they couldn't identify, toward darkness they couldn't penetrate, into landscapes they thought they knew, but could no longer navigate. Violence in those moments collapsed distinction between hunter and prey. Everyone became a silhouette, a sound, a shape interpreted as threat. The Laffertys moved through fog with weapons raised, firing at movement, at voices, at anything that suggested presence. "Por favor," someone whispered from beneath the Quonset hut's shadow. Joel hesitated. The Ruger aimed toward the voice, finger on the trigger. Then he fired 3 rapid shots that sparked against metal and gravel. The whispered pleading stopped. The first 911 call reached the sheriff's office at 7:22 p.m. The caller was Maria Gutierrez, speaking rapid Spanish, her voice breaking with terror. The dispatcher, who didn't speak Spanish, struggled to understand the location, the nature of emergency, the number of people hurt. By the time she'd dispatched Deputy Kaiser, 3 minutes had elapsed. While Deputy Kaiser drove south through fog with lights but no siren, visibility too poor for high speed, the killing continued at the trailer cluster. Joel Lafferty moved along the perimeter, checking between trailers and behind the Quonset hut. He found 2 farmhands crouched behind a propane tank, young men in their 20s, cousins who worked the same fields and lived 2 trailers apart. They raised their hands when Joel's flashlight found them. "Don't," one of them said in English. "Please, we don't know anything." Joel's hands trembled. His father's voice echoed in memory. A man defends his family. A man doesn't hesitate when everything depends on being strong. He fired the Ruger 22 4 times. The small caliber rounds didn't drop the men immediately. They fell slowly, clutching at wounds, trying to crawl toward anything that offered cover. Emergency medical reports later noted that one survived long enough to whisper "por favor" to arriving paramedics, though he died before reaching the hospital. Dale and Mitch swept through the remaining trailers, kicking doors open, shouting commands in English that terrified families couldn't fully understand. They found an elderly man hiding in a closet and shot him with the Winchester. They found a woman and her teenage daughter huddled in a bedroom and fired the shotgun through the doorway without confirming whether they hit anyone. The 2 Escobedo children who'd fled into the corn rows made it approximately 60 yards before exhaustion and terror stopped them. They crouched between frozen rows, breath coming in gasps, ears filled with the sound of their own heartbeats. Fog made navigation impossible. They couldn't see the trailers, couldn't determine which direction offered safety, couldn't tell if the sounds they heard were pursuit or imagination. Mitch found them by following their tracks in frost-covered ground. He stood above them for several seconds, shotgun raised, while they clung to each other and prayed in Spanish. Then he lowered the weapon and walked away. Later, during trial, psychologists would debate that moment, whether it represented mercy, hesitation, or simple exhaustion. Mitch never explained his reasoning. When asked directly, he said only, "Enough was enough." The final 4 victims were cornered near an old grain dryer at the edge of the property. Farmhands who'd tried to hide in the machine's shadow, thinking fog and metal might conceal them. A co-worker later testified hearing someone scream, "Stop!" followed by 2 shots, followed by silence so complete it seemed to absorb sound rather than simply mark its absence. By 7:45 p.m., the shooting had stopped. The Lafferty brothers stood near their truck, breath fogging the air, weapons empty or nearly so. The fog muffled everything, the distant sound of sirens, the cries of survivors, the quiet settling of bodies against frozen ground. In Boswell, 4 miles away, a church pancake supper continued without interruption. In Oxford, the high school girls' basketball team finished their game. In Fowler, Sheriff McCreary completed paperwork on a vandalism complaint, unaware that his county had just experienced its worst mass killing in recorded history. Violence, investigators note, isolates its victims and also its perpetrators. At 7:46 p.m., the Laffertys had crossed into territory from which return was impossible. They drove away slowly, headlights cutting weak tunnels through fog, leaving behind 12 bodies and a community destroyed. The scanner in Deputy Fran Kaiser's patrol car crackled with static and fragments. Multiple shots fired, aiming, many people hurt. But the fog made navigation treacherous. She drove 20 miles per hour on County Road 600 West, following the center line by memory more than sight, past intersections she couldn't see, past fields that existed only as black absences in peripheral vision. When she reached the turnoff to the trailer cluster, she killed her lights and rolled the last 100 feet. Training, instinct, fear, she couldn't articulate why, but approaching darkness with sirens felt wrong. She parked near the county road and proceeded on foot flashlight in one hand, service revolver in the other. The security light's glow was faint, diffused through fog into something that suggested illumination without providing it. She found Luis Peña first, his body already stiffening, blood no longer flowing but pooled beneath him like spilled oil. She checked for pulse, found none, continued forward. Marcos Escobedo lay 15 feet away, face down, one arm extended as if reaching for something. She didn't check for pulse. The wounds made it unnecessary. More shapes materialized as she moved between trailers. Ana Escobedo, the 9-year-old boy, the elderly man near the Quonset hut, the two cousins behind the propane tank. Her flashlight beam found blood, brass shell casings, footprints in frost, the scatter pattern of shotgun pellets against aluminum siding. She radioed for backup, for ambulances, for the sheriff. Her voice was steady but compressed, each word forced through narrowing windpipe. Multiple fatalities, at least 8, maybe more. Need FBI, state police, everyone. Sheriff McCreary arrived at 8:15 p.m., followed by 2 more deputies, then paramedics, then state police. They established a perimeter, cordoned off the scene, began the methodical documentation that transforms crime into evidence. Flash photography illuminated fog in bursts, white light reflecting back, creating halos around each body, each shell casing, each point of blood transfer. Forensic investigators arrived from Indianapolis at 10:30 p.m. They cataloged weapons trajectory, blood spatter, bullet fragmentation. They lifted boot prints from frost and gravel, lug sole patterns consistent with work boots, size 11 and 12. They recovered 30 .06 casings, 12-gauge shotgun shells, .22 caliber brass, all clustered in patterns that suggested firing positions. The 2 Escobedo children who'd hidden in the cornrows were found at 11 p.m. by a state trooper using a thermal imaging device. They were hypothermic, non-verbal, clinging to each other in the darkness. Paramedics wrapped them in thermal blankets and transported them to a hospital in Lafayette, where they would remain for 3 days, too traumatized to speak. By midnight, the count stood at 12 confirmed dead, 2 critical, 5 injured but stable. The FBI assumed jurisdiction due to the involvement of migrant workers. Federal law gave them authority over crimes affecting foreign nationals. Special Agent Warren Price flew in from Chicago at 2 a.m., toured the scene by portable floodlight, and immediately classified it as domestic terrorism pending further investigation. Sheriff McCreary stood near the Quonset hut, coffee cooling in a paper cup, staring at nothing. A state police lieutenant approached and asked if he had any leads, any suspects, any starting point. "They'll be local," McCreary said quietly. "Nobody comes from outside to do this. It's always someone who knows the land." Mass violence, investigators understand, is discovered in layers rather than all at once. First the bodies in plain sight, then the ones hidden in shadow, then the wounded who didn't call for help. Then the survivors, too terrified to reveal themselves. Each discovery recalibrates the scale of horror. The fog began lifting near dawn, revealing a landscape that seemed unchanged. Flat cornfields, distant farmhouses, the gray light of January morning, except for the trailers cordoned by yellow tape and the vehicles parked at angles, suggesting urgent arrival. Sheriff McCreary's initial report, written at 4 a.m., contained one line that would later be cited in federal analysis. 12 deceased, possible witness protection failure, perpetrators unknown, but methodology suggests planned execution. The sun rose at 7:23 a.m., indifferent and cold. The investigation moved with the methodical intensity of federal resources applied to unsolved massacre. FBI forensic teams processed the scene for 3 days, documenting trajectory angles, collecting biological evidence, mapping the sequence of violence through blood pattern analysis, and ballistic reconstruction. They found 43 shell casings, 15 .30-06 rifle rounds, 22 12-gauge shotgun shells, 6.22 caliber casings, distributed across approximately 1/4 acre of frozen ground. The breakthrough came from two sources, ballistics and blood. Indiana State Police lab technicians matched the 36 rounds to a Winchester Model 70 rifle. Distinctive rifling patterns narrowed the field to approximately 2,000 such weapons registered in northern Indiana. The blood evidence was more immediately useful. Partial boot prints in mud near the irrigation ditch contained residue from a specific type of lubricating oil used in small engine repair. Dale Lafferty's co-workers at the grain co-op provided the first real lead. 3 employees mentioned that Dale had asked questions about Luis Peña, where he lived, who he worked for, whether he'd been talking to anyone about witnessing something weeks earlier. One co-worker, interviewed on January 16th, recalled Dale saying, "Some things can't be left alone." Sheriff McCreary connected the dots. Calvin Ritchie's disappearance in December, the livestock sale where he'd last been seen, the Lafferty brothers' presence at that sale, the rumor that Luis Peña had witnessed something he shouldn't have. He brought his findings to the FBI task force on January 17th. Agents obtained warrants and descended on the Lafferty property at dawn on January 18th. They found Dale's Chevy K10 in the machine shed. Biological material still present in the truck bed, despite an apparent cleaning attempt. They found the 3 weapons, Winchester, Remington, Ruger, wrapped in a tarp behind the shed. Ballistics testing later confirmed matches to shell casings recovered at the scene. Mitch was arrested without incident, sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when agents entered. Dale tried to run but made it only as far as the tree line before surrendering. Joel was found in the shed, hands shaking, and confessed immediately upon being read his Miranda rights. "I didn't think we'd do it," he told Agent Price during the initial interview. "Even when we loaded the guns, I thought we'd turn back. But once it started, once Mitch shot that kid on the steps, it was like falling. You can't stop falling." Luis Peña's affidavit, sealed until after arrests were made, proved central to establishing motive. He'd written a detailed account of witnessing Mitch Lafferty kill Calvin Ritchie with a tire iron on December 18, 1998. He'd named witnesses, he'd provided times, locations, descriptions. He'd planned to give the statement to police after consulting with his uncle about safety concerns. He'd never made it that far. Evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. The brothers' phone records showing coordination in the days before the massacre, the weapons cleaning, the operational planning, Dale's questions at the co-op. The prosecution would later argue that this wasn't reactive violence born of sudden rage. It was calculated execution designed to eliminate everyone who might have knowledge of Calvin Ritchie's death. The defense struggled. Court-appointed attorneys attempted to introduce economic desperation and mental health issues, but the scale of violence and level of planning undermined any argument for diminished capacity. Character witnesses testified that the Laffertys were quiet men, churchgoers before their father's financial collapse, never violent toward neighbors or family. They were good people until they weren't, one former neighbor told reporters. Poverty changes people. Fear changes them more. The trials were moved to Tippecanoe County due to pretrial publicity and the impossibility of finding impartial jurors in Benton County. Proceedings began in August 1999 and lasted 5 weeks. Joel testified against his brothers as part of a plea agreement. His testimony provided operational details: who fired first, who made decisions, who expressed hesitation. He described the moment the massacre transitioned from theoretical planning to irreversible action when Mitch shot Luis Peña and then said, "It's done. No going back." The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning verdicts. Mitch Lafferty, guilty on 12 counts of first-degree murder, life without parole. Dale Lafferty, guilty on 12 counts of first-degree murder, 110 years. Joel Lafferty, guilty on 8 counts of second-degree murder, 70 years following his cooperation agreement. Sentencing occurred on October 15, 1999. Mitch showed no emotion when the verdict was read. Dale wept quietly. Joel wrote a letter to the court expressing remorse. "I hear them in the corn at night, their voices. I'll hear them until I die." The courtroom gallery was filled with survivors, family members, reporters, and law enforcement. Outside, protesters held signs calling for the death penalty. Others called for understanding of rural economic collapse. Justice, the judge noted in his remarks, rarely heals the wounds it's meant to address. The Escobedo trailers were condemned and demolished in spring 2000. The land returned to agricultural use, corn and soybeans planted over soil that had absorbed so much blood. Property records show it was sold twice in subsequent years, each time at below market rates. Most buyers avoided it once they learned its history. The 2 surviving Escobedo children, the ones who hid in the corn rows, were placed with relatives in Texas. Psychological evaluations documented severe PTSD, survivor guilt, inability to sleep without medication. One refused to speak Spanish for 3 years, as if the language itself carried contamination. The other developed selective mutism that persisted into adulthood. The migrant community that had clustered near the Quonset hut dispersed within months. Some families moved to other counties, other states. Others returned to Mexico or Texas, unwilling to remain in a place where safety had proven so fragile. The local Catholic Church established a memorial fund for victims' families, but contributions were modest and the fund depleted quickly. Benton County's economy continued its decline. The grain co-op where Dale worked closed in 2002. Earl Park Elementary School saw enrollment drop by 30% over 5 years. Young people left for cities where poverty didn't feel quite so isolating, quite so dangerous. The population of Earl Park fell below 600 by 2010. The Lafferty parents died within 18 months of their son's convictions, the father from heart failure, the mother from cancer that had gone undiagnosed and untreated. Neither attended the trials. Neighbors recalled seeing them at the IGA grocery store, moving through aisles like ghosts, eyes fixed on floor tiles, speaking to no one. Local children who'd lived near the trailer cluster reported nightmares for years, dreams of fog and gunshots, of running through corn that grabbed at clothes and skin, of voices calling for help in languages they didn't understand. Counselors from Lafayette provided trauma services, but funding ran out after 2 years. The physical evidence was stored in FBI warehouses: weapons, shell casings, photographs, blood-stained clothing, forensic reports. The investigative file was closed in 2004. No additional suspects sought, no outstanding questions requiring federal resources. In prison, the brothers were separated. Different facilities, minimal contact. Mitch maintained silence about that night, refusing interviews, declining to participate in psychological studies. Dale became religious, attending chapel services, reading scripture, writing apology letters that were never sent because there was no one left to receive them who wanted to read words from him. Joel wrote regularly to the families of victims, though most letters were returned unopened. He participated in restorative justice programs, spoke to criminology students about economic desperation and moral collapse. He maintained that he'd hesitated, that he'd considered refusing to participate, that the moment still haunted him. No one could verify or refute these claims. Memory and self-preservation blend too easily after trauma. Parole eligibility existed for Joel in 2069, when he would be 101 years old. Dale would be eligible in 2109. Mitch would die in prison, no possibility of release. The coffee thermos, dented metal unremarkable, remained in the evidence locker at the Indiana State Police headquarters in Indianapolis. It had been recovered from the Lafferty machine shed during the initial search, identified as belonging to the brothers, and retained as evidence, though it bore no forensic significance. No one ever claimed it. No one ever would. 26 years later, County Road 600 West still cuts through flat cornfields under gray skies. The gravel access road that leads to where the trailers once stood is overgrown, barely visible, used only by farm equipment during harvest. The Quonset hut collapsed in 2015, metal siding twisted and rusted, no one willing to invest in repair or demolition. Local histories of Benton County mention the massacre in clinical terms, dates, names, sentences, but avoid analysis, avoid assigning meaning to violence that resists meaning. It was economic desperation. It was honor culture. It was witness elimination. It was all those things, and none of them sufficiently. The community forgot names. Most residents under 30 don't know. Luis Peña, Marcos Escobedo, Ana Escobedo don't remember that 12 people died over a witnessed death that itself had been hidden and denied. But the silence remained, deeper than before, more careful. People learned not to talk about certain things, not to ask certain questions, not to trust that truth offers protection. The Earl Park Fire Department holds an annual memorial service on January 14th, though attendance has dwindled. A small plaque was installed at the county courthouse in 2005, listing the victims' names. Most people walk past without reading it. Children who were present that night, the Garcia family, the survivors hidden in bathtubs and beneath trailers, carry the weight into adulthood. Some left Indiana permanently. Others stayed but carried the knowledge that ordinary evenings can collapse into horror without warning, that fog can conceal killers, that rural silence protects the guilty as often as the innocent. Sheriff McCreary retired in 2003, haunted by the question of whether earlier intervention might have prevented the massacre. If Calvin Ritchie's death had been reported immediately, if Luis Peña had been provided witness protection, if economic support systems had existed for families like the Laffertys, these hypotheticals provided no comfort, only additional layers of failure. The grain dryer near where the final victims died still stands at the edge of a soybean field, rusted and silent. Wind threads through its gaps with a sound that resembles distant, uneven breath. Farmers pass it daily without acknowledgement. The land continues its cycles, planting, harvest, winter dormancy, indifferent to the violence it once witnessed. On cold January mornings, when fog settles low and thick across Benton County, some residents recall that night. They remember sirens, flashing lights, the weeks when federal agents filled the town's single motel. They remember fear that feels distant now, but never entirely absent. The coffee thermos remains unclaimed in the evidence locker, photographed and cataloged, a mundane object that once connected 3 men before connecting them to 12 murders. Communities don't heal from such violence. They endure it. They forget selectively. They rebuild partial structures over foundations that were never repaired. The county road stays quiet most evenings. The hollows, what passes for hollows inland this flat, keep their silences. And somewhere in that absence lives the memory of 12 people whose names most residents can no longer recite, who died because one teenager witnessed what he shouldn't have and couldn't remain silent about it.